Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my talk on Bach and Beethoven for Viking.TV. Whether you are an amateur or a connoisseur in classical music, or even someone who would just like to know more about it, I'm sure that you will find something in my talk of interest. My name is Lucy Hallman Russell. I am an Alabamian without a banjo, but with a harpsichord, piano, and organ, always close to my knees. I have spent most of my life in southern Germany, where I have taught at the Conservatory and the University of Music, Würzburg. Now, we are here in the Franconian wine region, and so it's not that far from the places where Bach and Beethoven came from, just about 3 hours in either direction. So this is providing me an opportunity to get to know their surroundings, their music, their organs, their churches quite well. Now, let's begin with our presentation. Johann Sebastian Bach and Ludwig van Beethoven are two of the greats in all of the world of classical music. And now, just because they both begin with a B doesn't mean that they are alike, nor that they are from the same era. They come actually from successive eras, and I will try to help you understand the differences between them. Johann Sebastian Bach was born in Eisenach in Thuringia, on former East Germany, into a musical family. Actually, it was a musical dynasty which lasted for well over 200 years, and so it is no wonder that the young Bach was able to quickly take over a position in the small town of Arnstadt as organist. Later, this church was named the Bach Church and was outfitted with a splendid organ, which you see here. His also had 2 manuals, but it was not as elaborate as this one. The young man was often reprimanded for small issues, but the most important one was that once he took a young girl up to the organ balcony with him. Fortunately, he married her, and with Maria Barbara Bach, he had many children, and altogether with his second wife, there were 20. Bach later worked at the Weimar court chapel. He was the court organist as well as the concert master, because he also played violin. But have a look at the only remaining picture of the Weimar court chapel here in the middle, where you can note that the organ is in the heavens on the 4th floor. So there was also place for the musicians, who were not considered of the same status as the aristocracy. Unfortunately, the chapel burned in the 1660s, so we are dependent on this one lovely painting of it. Johann Sebastian Bach was born in 1685, in the same year as Domenico Scarlatti and George Frederick Handel. And so we have many illustrious contemporaries, but none is as famous nowadays as he. So the signature that you see on your screen is very precious to us nowadays. But if you look underneath it, you see that in 1703, the payment for the quarter of the year was paid to the lackey Bach. Tells something about musical standing, doesn't it? The 17th century saw a great flourishing of music making, especially after the harsh 30 Years' War until 1648. So the second half of the century was on the rebound. And in this painting from Hamburg, you can also see 2 important composers who were great models for Bach. These are Reinken at the harpsichord and Buxtehude leaning on his hand with some music below it. Everything centers around the harpsichord, as you will see later. The next engagement was in the charming city of Curtin, and here you see the fine churches and also the very formal, elaborate layout of the palace there. Bach was held in higher esteem in Curtin, and because it was a secular court, he primarily dedicated himself to instrumental music. But at a certain point, the new princess was considered by Bach to be an Amusa, and that doesn't have to do with her being an amusing lady, but rather with her being unmusical. Nevertheless, Bach retained good relationships with Curtin and its court even after he went on to his last major engagement. He actually held a Curtin court title in perpetuity. The great contemporaries of Bach must be listed here. His colleague, George Friedrich Handel, was born not far away in Halle, in Eastern Germany, but unfortunately the two never met because Handel as a young man went to Hanover and then later followed his Hanoverian elector to England, where the elector of Hanover founded the dynasty of the Hanoveraner as kings of England, and this lasted for 123 years. In London, Handel promoted both the Italian opera and particularly the English oratorio. George Philipp Telemann worked primarily in Hamburg, but he had also been in Leipzig as a predecessor of Bach, and he was a godfather to one of the Bach sons. This close family relationship extended lifelong. But I have to mention that it was Handel and Telemann who corresponded avidly about everything from music to gardening, but in the French language. It was the language of the nobility, the lingua franca of the era, although both of them were native German speakers. Couperin and Rameau were setting the new styles of French music in Paris. Vivaldi with his concertos in Venice, Chorale the violinist in Rome, and the great keyboardist Domenico Scarlatti with some 600 sonatas for the court in Madrid. So you can see that it was indeed a very colorful era for music making. Quite a number of these composers were also organists, so we will especially turn our attention to the organ today. And I wanted you to see a great Baroque organ in Freiberg, which is not far from Dresden in the state of Saxony. The Middle German, North German, and Dutch organs were very large in the Baroque era and had full-scale pedal boards. Sometimes they had 3 manuals, but usually only 2, with a great many stops or registers, as you see here. Bach even composed works for 6 parts, 2 for each of the hands and 2 for the pedals. But it's a good thing that these works are somewhat slower than others. There was another tradition in Italy and also in England, where there were few or no pedals, so the composition is primarily only for the hands. Take a look at Bach's manuscript. Some violinists today even take great pleasure in the swirls and eloquence of the violin sonata depicted on the left. But there are very few organists who can come to grips with the notation on the right of a chorale prelude. We find here that all three parts for both hands and the pedals are written on only two staves, somewhat cluttered, wouldn't you think? And then we note Bach's frugality at the bottom of the page, where he declined to waste another page of paper for the last line of the composition, but rather he wrote it in a special notational code called South German organ tablature. I can't read it, and there are very few who can. But one of the main instruments of the 18th century was indeed the harpsichord, which is a plucked instrument. Here we have a very beautiful harpsichord with the newest fashion of chinoiserie paintings on the side of it. This instrument by Mietke can still be seen in Schloss Charlottenburg in Berlin. But German harpsichords could also be somewhat cumbersome, as seen here in instruments by the great family of builders named Huss. The two manuals make it a really large instrument with many possibilities, but the instrument on the left, the three-manual one, is unique. There is none other like it. I must say that these instruments are less elegant than the Italian and the French instruments, but you can see that they provided Bach with a great deal of sound. When we consider the instrumental forms of the Baroque, it may be helpful to you to have a short overview. A toccata or a prelude is a free piece without any fixed form, and so they can be very delightful and interesting and surprising. But a prelude always means that something follows it, and what follows it is usually a fugue. Fugue means a flight, and so it is one voice imitating and chasing the next. Fugues may be in 3, 4, or 5 parts, but mostly in 4. So this is the contrast between the free composition and the strict imitative composition. Lutheran church music is based on chorales, and there is a great body of hymns or chorales in the German language. They were recommended to be sung at home as well as in church, and the organist often improvised or composed a chorale prelude to introduce the melody to the congregation. Trio and solo sonatas became prominent as well. As for larger ensembles, we have to look to the great countries of Italy and France for our models. The Italians provided the concerto grosso, or great concert, and it is essentially a group of perhaps only 20 musicians, with the large group contrasting with only a few soloists, 2 or 3. The French overture was to open the way for the entrance of a king, and so it begins with a very majestic movement in a dotted rhythm. And of course, Bach learned to compose Italian music and French music just as well as the natives. One concern of the Baroque is with ornaments, with the beautifications, or abbellimenti in Italian, of the essential composition. Bach left us with these 2 lines of ornament symbols and their realizations, or how they are to be played. And so today, certainly all harpsichordists and organists, as well as pianists who take on Bach, must learn how to do it correctly. Bach was a clavierist. He played the clavier with a C. And so I must tell you that this is a generic term for all of the prominent keyboard instruments of the era. And these are harpsichord, the plucked instrument, clavichord, an instrument with a tiny tangent making a soft sound, the grand organ, and the quite new forte piano. So much of this music is also interchangeable, and I must say that this has been my career. I too am a clavierist and play all of these instruments. Bach left us with something that is considered the New Testament of keyboard playing in his Well-Tempered Clavier, books 1 and 2 from 1722 and 44. And they are indeed the pinnacle of traditional harmony, comprised of preludes and fugues, that is, the free piece and the imitative piece in each of the 24 keys. So he begins with a prelude and fugue in C major, then C minor, C sharp major, C sharp minor, just up every note within an octave. And this twice over in these two excellent books of music. Now, what does well-tempered clavier mean? It essentially means well-tuned, so that you can play in every key. Unfortunately, there has been a misunderstanding, and many consider this the same as equal temperament, in which the octave is divided up equally, even though it contains a slight error. So a modern piano is tuned in equal temperament, but in Bach's time, there were very many different good tunings, well-tuned instruments, which provided for playing in different keys, but gave each key a character, a specific flavor. I would like to share with you Historical Organ by Johann Bernhard Ehrlich from 1786, really a Baroque organ which has just recently been restored in the relatively small church of St. Georg in Markt Nordheim. This is also in the region of Bavaria, just between Würzburg and Nuremberg. And so let me play for you a small excerpt from a live performance that I played there on Good Friday of this year. And I will also show you something of the interchangeability of these instruments, because the well-tempered clavier has no pedal parts written, but you can add a few here and there as you like. So we will hear a short excerpt from a prelude and of the fugue in C major from the second book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. But after his stints at the courts of Weimar and Cöthen, Bach was off to Leipzig for the rest of his life, from 1723 to 1750, which was more or less the exact same period that Handel spent in London. We see here what a glorious city Leipzig is in the state of Saxony. We find the old city hall on the right and the old stock market called the Börse in the center and left. This is the site of a great university, of the founding of the great centuries-old book fairs and book traders associations, the first encyclopedia in the German language, as well as the city of writers and thinkers. Leipzig was very progressive and was called the Singing Muse on the Pleiße River. So in this engraving, we have the opportunity of seeing a clavichord. It is the small box on the tables, which produces actually a very intimate sound, but provides an opportunity for the organist to practice at home out of the cold of the churches in winter. But in the churches, it was important to have these very great organs, and Bach himself was an expert at designing organ and contributed to the designs on a number of occasions. Here we see one of these, the Pauline organ in Leipzig. Further views of Leipzig show that the Renaissance and Baroque architecture partially still exists, as well as the more classicistic architecture with the old Börse and a statue of Goethe on the right. But our point of concentration must go to the great churches of Leipzig. Bach was called by the Ratsherren, the city council, to take on the position of Cantor at the great Thomas Church. There were 4 men whose names were in the hat, but for different reasons. Telemann's name was there, only to extort higher pay for his position in Hamburg, so he was immediately out of the running. The next 2, Foch and Graupner, were not able to obtain permission to leave their present posts. So, as one council member said, since we couldn't get the best men, we took the 3rd choice, which was Johann Sebastian Bach. Little did they know what renown and acclaim his accomplishments, his compositions, would bring to the city of Leipzig. The Thomas Church, of course, was a medieval church, as you see here, but have a look at the end of the lane or on the side of the church on the left. The house at the end of the lane on the right with a red roof was the schoolhouse, and this was where the Bach family lived, as well as the choir boys. So Bach's duties were very multifaceted. He was essentially a dormitory supervisor, the choir master, the music instructor, and he also had to teach the boys mathematics and Latin. But fortunately, he could often find a substitute for this particular duty. It is said that the Bach household was open for all musicians passing through town. And so it was through these exchanges and also copying out music that Bach got to know all of the trends and the avant-garde in music of the era. It was handy to have a lot of children, a musical wife, and the choir boys, because they could also help in the onerous task of copying out the music for performances. Bach's second wife, Anna Magdalena, also had 13 children, to add to the earlier ones, but 7 of them died in infancy. So it is unclear as to how many Bach children were here in Leipzig, but a great many, and 4 of them became famous composers: Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach in Berlin, Potsdam, and Johann Christian Bach as the London Bach. Lutheran church music for the Thomas Church, as well as for the Nikolai Church and 3 lesser churches, were on Bach's agenda every week. He composed a cantata for every week of the church year, and we believe that he attained 5 years' worth of church music. So that means some 60 cantatas in the year, as well as larger works for the highest holidays. The German chorale, or hymn, in an AAB form, is probably very familiar to you from our hymns that we sing nowadays. The great body of German hymns was sung with a melody only in the churches, but it was encouraged to sing these hymns with their sometimes up to 15 strophes at home for spiritual edification and also for learning the language better. A chorale was also included in the Sunday cantata, perhaps even 2, with a couple of arias and recitativos. The recitativo is a declamation of a great deal of text with very little music, whereas the aria is more contemplative on the subject matter at hand. These cantatas were written especially for the particular Sunday of the year. The oratorio and the passion are the large church works in the Lutheran Church, the oratorio being based on biblical stories, and the passion specifically on the suffering and crucifixion of Christ. So these included all the aspects of the cantata, as well as larger choral works. The second major church for which Bach was responsible was the Nikolai Church in Leipzig. Again, a medieval church with a glorious interior and organ. And you may have heard more about this church in modern times than about the Thomas Church, because this was the site of the Monday demonstrations which brought down former East Germany in 1989. I know that I was always watching television to see events taking place there. But the Thomas and the Nikolai churches alternated years with the great Good Friday Passions. The St. John Passion was brought by Bach the first year that he was engaged in Leipzig. It is very dramatic and lasts something like 2 to 2.5 hours. And 4 years later, he presented the greatest of these works, several of which are lost, and this was the Matthew Passion of 1727. It includes 2 choirs plus a children's choir, boys' choir, as well as 2 orchestras, and lasts a bit over 3 hours. I must say, I consider it the most significant religious sacred work in the Western tradition. You can see from the manuscript here on the right that this is a recitativo with only a couple of notes for chords in the bass line and a lot of articulated text in the right. The evangelist is singing the words of Christ on the cross. Therefore, they were notated in red. Now I would like to present you with a special treat performed just for this talk in these days, an aria from the St. Matthew Passion, Aus Liebe will mein Heiland sterben. From love will my Savior die. talented young Russian soprano Maria Shuliakovskaya will sing to my accompaniment on a Schlimbach organ from 1865 in the Franconian Hospice Church located here in Aube, where I live. We will present you just with a short excerpt from this very beautiful aria.
Sagt
Bach has inspired painters and artists as well as musicians and thinkers in the centuries since he departed from us. I wanted to share with you also this very beautiful depiction of Bach with an organ by a modern German artist, Simon Dietrich. This engraving is also in my own personal collection. But let's have a look at what was going on in Leipzig. The paid city musicians were only allowed to perform for city functions, so they could not join the traditional ad hoc university Collegium Musicum, which was founded in Leipzig by Telemann before he went to Hamburg, and then continued by Johann Sebastian Bach. He was not paid for this service, nor were the musicians paid, but it was a great opportunity to try out new music and to build a musical public. Here we have depictions from some other Collegia Musica in Europe. Let's begin with the bottom one. Here in Winterthur in Switzerland, we see the harpsichord in the middle, the musicians standing at continuous music stands all around the room, and some instruments hung on the walls. There is no public, so this could well have been a rehearsal or just a gathering to make music for themselves. On the right, in Vienna, we see a public performance, much with the same lineup all around the harpsichord, where the composer and conductor usually led the performances. A conductor did not always stand in front of the musicians, waving his hands, but rather he participated. And in many cases, where there were often only 20 musicians in a Baroque ensemble, the lead would be taken by the first violin. Here we see an audience standing around the stage and a great many people watching from the splendid building above. But on the upper left, from Basel, also in Switzerland, we see how chaotic such ad hoc Collegia Musica could be, with people sitting, standing, participating, looking for their music, trying to find enough space to participate. Then we can have a brief look at the Collegium Musicum in Leipzig. There were no concert halls readily available in the 18th century. This was only something that developed during the course of the century, and so Bach's Collegium Musicum met at the Café Zimmermann, which is just to the right of the center line in the engraving on the right. On the left, we see that there were also evening performances in Leipzig, all the musicians standing, mostly playing by memory, and don't forget to note how important the torchbearers are, which provided a little bit of light. The Collegium Musicum was a vivacious ensemble of young people, and so for this reason, many university Collegia Musica are named Collegium Musicum for this reason. We have Bach's personal seal on the left. It is only the figure in the middle, but I wanted to include those on the right and left to show you the artistic combining of a mirror image of his initials, JSB. On the right, we find a musical motive based on Bach's names. Now, in German, B, or B, is the term for B flat, and H, or H, is the term for B natural, going back to a medieval tradition. So BACH provides a wonderful motive which Bach and also later composers used. B-A-C-H, B-A-C-H. It is only 4 notes, which could be spread out quite a bit and might almost disappear as the hidden symbol in a musical composition. From Bach's own words, we have the following. I play the notes as they are written, but it is God who makes the music. The final aim and reason of all music is nothing other than the glorification of God and the refreshment or uplifting of the spirit. What I have achieved by industry and practice, anyone else with tolerable natural gift and ability can also achieve. That's a good encouragement, but it's hard to accomplish. And finally, harmony is next to godliness. So you see throughout these comments that Bach's primary aim with all music, whether it be sacred or secular, was for the glorification of God. His grave in the Thomas Church in Leipzig is always adorned with flowers, as is Monteverdi in Venice. But this gives us, in this very short introduction to a very great composer, the opportunity to transition to another great, Ludwig van Beethoven. Both of these composers wrote variations, but for quite different reasons. A harpsichordist named Goldberg had to play each evening for his patron, an aristocrat, who suffered terribly from insomnia. So Goldberg asked Bach to compose a lengthy composition for him to play in the evenings. Bach took a French sarabande as his model and created 30 elaborate variations on it, which doesn't make any of us go to sleep in 45 minutes or an hour and a half if the worthy repeats are played. But it is an interesting origin for the music of one of the greatest and most difficult harpsichord pieces. On the right, we have a silly waltz by the amateur composer and music printer, publisher, Anton Diabelli. Diabelli wrote to 50 composers, asking each of them to contribute a single variation on his waltz, which he would then publish. Beethoven considered the idea, but missed the deadline, and so the publication was almost ready when Beethoven suddenly came back to the simple waltz and found that it would be a good vehicle for very complex elaborations. So he wrote 33 variations on the waltz by Diabelli. He was not too happy, however, when these were published together with the 50. Ludwig van Beethoven was born in 1770, some 20 years after Johann Sebastian Bach, in the city of Bonn, in the Rhine region, the Rhineland of Germany. He lived until 1827, spending most of his time in the great imperial city in Vienna. There is, however, a fine archive, library, and museum at the birthplace of Beethoven in Bonn. In his earlier years, we already find portraits of Beethoven, but the one in the middle shows us that the new idea of him was that he was a romantic composer, sitting outdoors in nature beside a brook with pen and paper in hand, absorbing inspiration from nature. But this is not exactly how he composed. Let me share some comments by Beethoven with you to show what his thoughts were. There are and always will be thousands of princes, but there is only one Beethoven. To play a wrong note is insignificant. To play without passion is inexcusable. I will take fate by the throat. It will never bend me completely to its will. Just from these words, you can see what a different life, psychology, attitude, and experience Beethoven had. His contemporaries in Vienna were quite famous, and these include Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who came to study a bit with Haydn, as Beethoven also did a bit later. Haydn primarily worked as a servant of the court for the Esterhazy outside Vienna, and it was only in his later life that he could live in the city and travel abroad. Franz Schubert was much younger than Beethoven, but died only a year later, leaving behind a continuation of Beethoven's symphonic tradition and a great body of lieder or songs, perhaps some 600 in all. So although there were others across Europe, I will take only the time to mention these three in Vienna. Let's have a look at the great city of Vienna. In a painting by Canaletto, you can see here how splendid the churches were, the palaces, the gardens, the clothing of the garden promenaders who had enough time to enjoy all of the good things of this great city. It is said that the aristocrats from all over Europe, from Poland, from Russia, and elsewhere, kept their palaces in Vienna to come in the winter when all of the museums were open, when there were many delights, many concerts to be enjoyed. This was something quite unusual in all of the great cities of Europe at the end of the 18th century. We still admire St. Stephen's Cathedral, a great medieval Gothic edifice in Vienna, and its three organs have been consistently renewed even recently. Schönbrunn is the name of the imperial palace in Vienna, where the Empress Maria Theresia had a long reign until 1780, and was followed by her son Joseph II. So Vienna was the city of the court, the imperial court. Beethoven was constantly trying to get a position at court, but perhaps he didn't really want one due to his strident independence. Let's have a look at the classical musical forms, which are different from those of the Baroque. Here there is more emphasis on the solo instrument, so we find solo sonatas for piano or violin, as well as concertos with orchestra. Haydn is considered the godfather or the grandfather of the string quartet, and this continued with Beethoven. The lied or song was imported in the German language. Essentially, for the first time was there such a flowering of German song through the Lutheran Church, and then especially in the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. As for larger works, we no longer have concerti grossi and overtures, but rather a symphony of usually 4 movements, as well as operas of 3 movements. Now, what do you do, though, if you have been so fortunate as to enjoy a great performance in Vienna, whether it be at the palace, in an opera house, or at the palaces of the aristocracy, in the gardens or parks? how do you take this music with you? You can't press a button and play it on any of the means that have been known in our lifetimes, but rather one sought out the music publishers and obtained a four-handed piano arrangement. It was at this time that the bourgeoisie had the time and the money to afford themselves music instruments, music instruction, concerts, performances, music instruments, and also the notes for four-handed piano arrangements. If we have a look at Beethoven's manuscripts, though, you can see that this was not what you would like to take home to play from. They are scribbled across the page, difficult to read, with frequent striking out of an idea which could be improved upon. So this also shows perhaps the turmoil in his spirit. But this was the great era of music publishers. Once again, beginning already in Bach's lifetime in Leipzig, Breitkopf und Härtel still exists today, as does Schott in Mainz. Simrach in Bonn saw premieres of 13 great works of Beethoven, and they are also still in existence, but under a different name, which is Buzy and Hawkes. You can see the new script of the firm Breitkopf on the left, which shows the old German Fraktur, and it was invented also for the publications of another great of the era, Immanuel Kant. In the middle, we see a soft limestone from the town of Solnhofen, which was very important for music printing. Of course, the music had to be etched onto it in reverse. But lithography, invented also at the end of the 18th century, was very important for music printing. We find splendid portraits and busts of Beethoven. The one on the right reminds us of another short man, but great man, who was Napoleon Bonaparte. The great tragedy, however, in Bach's life was his progressive deafness, which led to total deafness. A friend of his by the name of Melzel invented an instrument which might be familiar to all of those who have had very strict piano teachers, and this is the metronome, which looks much the same today as this pyramid, which provides the eternal tick-tock for keeping the beat of piano beginners. But another invention by Melzel was more important for Beethoven, and this was the ear trumpets, because they were an attempt to allow Beethoven to hear the instruments and the music, which he could otherwise only hear in his head. It is said that his malady could have been relieved by a simple operation in modern times, but this was not his fate, and it led him to be an outcast because he could not follow conversation except with notes, written notes, and so it contributed to his depression, his sense of being alone, and his great loss of having a great love of his life. The instruments that Beethoven esteemed were primarily those built in Vienna. From the beautiful fortepianos of Anton Walter on the left, we see that the keys were sometimes black and the sides cut off on the diagonal. Now, the rumor is that this was constructed in this way to better show off the delicate white hands of the family's daughters learning to play piano. I am not sure this was the case. Ivory, however, was not really available for the keyboards until the 19th century in England. In the middle, you see my own forte piano, patterned after the Walter from 1690, and with a beautiful amber finish on the cherry wood. The mechanism is much smaller than that of a modern piano, with very tiny hammers striking against it and individual dampers in the row across the top in red and white. On the right, though, you can see a Conrad Graf piano from the early 19th century, also highly esteemed by Beethoven, with its expanded range to over 6 octaves and multiple pedals. Now, have you asked why we have multiple pedals more than today? These were for a special effect that one enjoyed on piano playing, which was adding the sound effects of the Turkish Janissary music with small cymbals or drums or even a bassoon stop. But in any case, the Graf piano had a larger and warmer sound. Pianos were all the rage in Vienna and throughout Europe of the 18th century. As you see here, we have a lyra and a pyramid piano. And there were also giraffe and bookcase pianos. The upright ones were especially convenient for personal homes because they took up less floor space. There was a single woman who was famous in piano building, and this was Nanette Stein-Streicher, the daughter of Johann Andreas Stein of Augsburg, one of the first great fortepiano builders. She was a personal friend of Beethoven's and created an instrument of 6 octaves for him. He was always demanding more substance and strength from the instruments, also because he could hear less and less. I also show a piano by John Broadwood in London, who was kind enough to donate a piano to Beethoven. Music should strike fire from the heart of man and bring tears from the eyes of woman, is another quote from Beethoven. And so whether the music making was in an aristocratic setting, as on the left, where Beethoven is playing, or whether it is just among women and for personal friends, as on the right, it was very important to play with passion. And this was one of the characteristics of the new Romantic era, which followed on the classical order and discipline of Mozart and Haydn and expanded to these passions. In Vienna, the relatively unhappy Beethoven was constantly changing his place of abode. And so he lived in 70 different apartments, some of them repetitions, however. The Pascolati house is one of the most famous, as it is now a musician dedicated to the composer. And I hope that you like the quote on the wall here. "The lodging is not for rent. Beethoven will be back again." And indeed he was. He stayed there several occasions, always hoping that a change of location would improve his health. Beethoven was also on friendly terms with the great German writer of the era, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, seen on the right, and they met in the Bohemian spa of Teplitz, in the depiction in the middle. It seems, however, that Goethe was enjoying more reverence behind the loner Beethoven walking all by himself. Goethe said of Beethoven, "He is an extraordinary talent who is untamed, however. And although one cannot disregard his opinion that the world is often detestable, he does not make it any better for himself or others by his actions. Beethoven also stayed at a theater in Vienna. This was the Theater an der Wien, the theater on the Vienna River, in 1803 and 1804. Parts of his opera, the Third Symphony and the Kreutzer Sonata, originated here. And it was here that his opera Fidelio and other works found their premieres. So it was not only opera which was performed in a theater, which is also available today for performances, and I have been there. Fidelio, also called Leonora, was Beethoven's only opera, and it is a rescue opera about conjugal love, with the wife Fidelio or Leonora rescuing her husband Florestan from prison. Have a look at the theater billing in the middle, Fidelio or the state prison. Down below you see Madame Fischer, who was a singer passing through and would give only one performance. But is it easy to find the name Beethoven? I'll give you a hint. If you look just above the large horizontal line, you will see "with music by Beethoven." So the composer was often less important than the prima donna or the virtuoso singer. Now on the left is an interesting phenomenon of the 19th century. There were souvenir depictions from operas throughout the century, including Richard Wagner, printed on Liebig Company's meat extract jars. And so there are a great collection of these which became souvenir items, although I have little understanding for what Fidelio and Wagner's operas have to do with Liebig's meat extract. Another couple of quotes from Beethoven. Music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy. Don't only practice your art, but force your way into its secrets, for it and knowledge can raise men to the divine. As you can see here, there are great philosophical thoughts associated with Beethoven's perusings. His monumental Third Symphony is called the Eroica, and at first Beethoven intended to dedicate it to Napoleon, whom he greatly admired. But when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, Beethoven scratched out the dedication. It was no longer dedicated to Napoleon, but Beethoven also said it was dedicated to the memory of a great man. We are fortunate that Prince Lobkowitz had such a splendid palace for the performance of the Eroica in this Eroica Hall, still to be visited in central Vienna. Now, the orchestra of Beethoven often had only 40 players, or perhaps only 30, but it was already considerably larger than the usual Baroque ensemble of 20. Beethoven's funeral showed the acclaim which he had attained throughout Vienna and the Western world, with the participation of thousands. Although he died, probably of cirrhosis of the liver, in lesser conditions in the Black Spaniard house depicted in the middle, with his instrument strewn with manuscripts and his bookcase in disarray. But his tombstone, his grave in the Vienna Central Cemetery, is the site of pilgrimage of his admirers even today. But let's have a quick bit of comparison between Bach and Beethoven to remind you of what we have talked about. Bach was from a musical dynasty. He lived with music. He was also a family man with 2 wives and a great number of children. In contrast to Beethoven, who was from a dysfunctional family, whose father was a drunkard, and who left home early to move to Vienna. He was a loner. He was never successful in his love affairs and spent a life of sadness amidst his grand thoughts. Bach was a servant of the court and the church. He had financial security, but also suffered from the restrictions, the limitations of these positions, for which he must ask for permission to leave town or even to change positions. Bach was different from Beethoven in that the latter was a freelance musician who depended on patronage concerts and publications of his works, with all of their concomitant perils. For Bach, the motto was Soli Deo Gloria, to God be all the glory, in all of his works, whether they be sacred or secular. But Beethoven wrote for mankind, for the universality of music, of thought, in keeping with ideals also of the Enlightenment. We can also compare 2 great works by Bach and Beethoven, although it seems that neither of them was Catholic. Bach wrote the great B minor Mass to be dedicated to the Elector of Saxony, August III, who wanted to become Polish king. The condition of this title, however, was that he become Catholic. So no problem, overnight, Dresden became Catholic. Beethoven composed a solemn Mass, a Missa Solemnis, with all of the parts, for the inauguration or installation of the Archduke as an archbishop. But neither of these works is actually appropriate for a church service, for a Mass, because they are of such large proportions that they can essentially only be performed in concert. We can make some further comparisons, however. Bach was an excellent keyboardist on all instruments: harpsichord, clavichord, organ, and fortepiano, while Beethoven was a brilliant pianist, exploiting this newly popular instrument to its utmost. While Beethoven wrote for this instrument, as well as for all instruments, Bach was dedicated to both the clavier, spelled with a C, and to choral music. Bach wrote no opera, and Beethoven only a one, because he was also not a composer particularly known for his understanding of the voice. At the end of Bach's life, he was deemed somewhat old-fashioned, because the new Rococo, pre-classic, even in the compositions of his sons, had taken over. But Beethoven reached a pinnacle of new creation, which provided a model for his successors. As everyone knows, Beethoven composed 9 symphonies, and there was something of a curse associated with this number 9. Composers did not believe that they would live to compose a 10th symphony. And this was indeed the case with Bruckner, with Dvorak, with Vaughan Williams, and the composer Mahler tried to avoid the issue by not naming his 9th symphony the 9th. But he too did not finish his 10th symphony. The 9th symphony of Beethoven is of a structure and grandeur unseen beforehand. The symphonies of Mozart, some 41, are much smaller in size, as are those, over 100, of Joseph Haydn. But Beethoven's 9th all last a great deal longer, demand more instruments, and a greater contrast than ever before in the movements. The 9th symphony is famous, especially for its association in the 4th movement with Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy from 1775. And so in concluding my all too brief commentary on 2 of the greatest of the world's composers, I would like for you to consider this poem opening the way for a new era, and now standing as the hymn of Europe. We will hear, in conclusion, a short excerpt from Beethoven's 9th Symphony with the following poem. Joy, thou beauteous, godly lightning, daughter of Elysium, fire drunken, we are entering heavenly thy holy home. Thy enchantments bind together what did custom stern divide. Every man becomes a brother where thy gentle wings abide. Thank you for joining me today, and I will look forward to discussing further with you on a Viking cruise.